Hi guys, welcome to the Headphone Show. For today's topic, I want to talk about why it's so common to find reviews or impressions of headphones that contradict one another or differ to the degree that they do. You may be doing research on a headphone that you're potentially interested in buying, and you come across one review that says something is elevated in the upper mid-range, and then you come across another review of the same headphone where someone says it's recessed in the upper mid-range. Now, what are you supposed to do about that? Well, it's probably the case that in many of these situations, one of these is just wrong. And if you were to show that person the frequency response and then, play a certain track for them and point out a specific thing about the headphone that, they'd have more time to experience that and then, conclude the same thing that you did or that the other person did. But there are also plausible reasons why impressions differ that have nothing to do with whether or not somebody is right or wrong. So the first and probably the most common reason that I'd like to point out is that we don't have any standards for the terms that we're using. Yes, there's a general understanding of what a lot of these terms mean, but everything from, the descriptions of soundstage to different ranges of the frequency response, it's not clear that everybody is using the same definition. So, for example, some might consider the upper mid-range to be anywhere from 1 to 2 kHz. Other people might consider this the upper mid-range to be anywhere from 2 to 3 kHz. And so in cases like this, it's possible for both assertions to be true. It's just that they're using different definitions. Now, before you guys jump in and say, I know what the frequency response ranges are, this is where upper mid-range is, etc. That's not really the point. The point is that even if you're right, that doesn't necessarily mean that everybody else is using that same definition. And if you just do a little bit of Googling about this as well, you'll see that, there are some, again, general claims about this kind of stuff that you can find, but even amongst publications, there's not really a consensus there. Some call anything above 2K hertz treble. Other people call 4K to 6K hertz presence region. So there's all kinds of terms that are being thrown around here that when we're reporting our experiences, we don't have a unified demarcation for those ranges. We don't have a unified definition for what is upper mid-range. So again, you might have the right answer, but that doesn't mean that the person that you're reading or the person reporting their experience about the headphone is using that definition. A lot of the time when we're thinking about bass, mids, and treble, we're thinking about specific instruments that fall within the various different ranges. So when you're reading something that says dipped upper mid-range or elevated upper mid-range, more often than not, that has more to do with the way that this person heard those instruments that they associate with those frequencies, not necessarily the specific frequency ranges. And by the way, I'm also guilty of this as well. I think it's just really easy to report, I think it's, elevated in this area and recessed in this area, because then we don't have to be specific about what we're talking about. You can give a general attribution to that, but that's where this problem starts to show up, where we haven't demarcated the frequency ranges the same way across the board, and then you end up with these conflicting or contradicting impressions. Additionally, there are also no standards for describing a headphone's technical performance. There's a general sense, but that's about it. I mean, when we're using terms like dynamics or soundstage, we're not necessarily talking about the same things as other people when they're using those terms. Soundstage, for example, people will sometimes talk about how open something sounds, but that probably has more to do with headphones extension or extension capabilities and airy qualities right at around 12K hertz rather than the speaker-like or presentation for the images and how far away from you they are, the distance and the range and the depth and that kind of stuff. So it's really easy to get confused there, but then probably the most confusing one is the term dynamics. Now, I like to refer to this as that punch and slam quality, but remember that it doesn't matter which of these is correct, it just matters that other people aren't using this the same way. So if I think of dynamics as this punch or slam quality, somebody else might be using maybe an older definition of this sort of macro dynamics or micro dynamics, which refers more to the gradations or the intervals for volume. And, I think they're both useful, and I think they're actually describing different things. What I might be talking about has to do with the excursive capability of the driver, of the transducer. What somebody else might be talking about isn't necessarily that. It's actually much more closely related to the perception of detail. And so when we use a catch-all term like dynamics, that actually can lead to confusion because they mean different things. And so again, regardless of what's right or what the proper definition is for this, the fact of the matter is that people are using them in different ways, and this leads to these kinds of conflicting opinions. The next explanation that I want to focus on is one that I think isn't talked about enough, and that's unit variation. Now, ideally, the manufacturing process refines this enough that it doesn't always happen, and you actually get your variation to be as minimal as possible, but it's still bound to occur, especially in planar magnetic headphones, and this is the most common area. For example, the Ether 2 that I reviewed, I actually had two units side by side, and they measured so dramatically different from one another that I thought one of them was defective. In reality, it's probably just, there was a bit of unit variation there. The early units didn't measure the same as the later units. And the same is true for a lot of the Odyssey headphones. In the past, they've also had quite a bit of unit variation there. But of course, it's not just planars. Like I've actually experienced it with the Focal Stellia again, where the base elevation there is at a different part, and it makes a big difference where it is. The one that I originally evaluated, the base elevation was quite a bit higher up, and it didn't sound anywhere near as clean as this one here does. So hopefully, that improves over time, and we end up with better manufacturing process that don't have this kind of unit variation. But it's still worth keeping in mind that when you're reading somebody's impressions and they don't line up with your experiences or somebody else's experience, it's quite possible that they have a headphone that has a different frequency response from another unit of the same model that somebody else has. The next thing I want to focus on sounds like it should be obvious, but it actually means more than we think, and it's that we all have different physical shapes to our ears. Now, again, you guys are thinking, well, of course, there's subjectivity and preferences and all this stuff, but the physical shape and the way that our ears are structured and how they're different from one another will have an impact on the way that something sounds. To be more specific, the different parts of the ear will affect or amplify certain frequencies. And so that's why when you see a raw frequency response graph, you'll see that it goes up quite a bit, quite dramatically. It's not just a flat line, across. And it's the pinna and the concha, the part of the ear, that create this amplification and this elevation there. That if you heard a headphone that was quote unquote neutral or tuned to a Harman target curve, it would appropriately follow this shape. And of course, the ear canal also has an effect on this as well. And actually, I've found that the ear canal contributes the most dramatically to IEMs. I've encountered people who hear an IEM completely differently from the way that I do, just because we have different shapes to the ear canal. And then again, if you think about some of the measurement rigs like that one that I have behind me there, or some of the more precise ones like the head and torso simulators, they're all trying to simulate an ear of some kind, specifically because it affects the frequency response or how something sounds. So when I say we all have different ears, there's more to it than just a subjective preference, or we hear things with a certain subjectivity. But that also doesn't discount what our expectations and preferences are for headphones. So for example, if you are only listening to heavy metal music or music with electric guitars, and you hear something that is a little bit recessed at around 3K hertz, and that sounds normal to you, and then suddenly you listen to a headphone that elevates that range a little bit, that's likely going to sound quite a bit more shrill and harsh to you. And then you might report that, it's got an elevated, whatever you want to call it, let's call it upper mid-range or lower treble. And then somebody else might think, it has an elevated upper mid-range or lower treble. I'm not going to necessarily like it as much. But that person only listens to piano music or jazz music or classical music, where a recession in that same frequency range would actually be considerably worse. And this headphone that is a little bit, more, let's call it linear there, is going to be actually the better choice. So, what your expectation is for the music that you're listening to and the genres that you're listening to can have a huge impact on the way that you report this stuff. So, how do we solve this problem? How do we figure out which impressions or reviews to pay attention to and which ones to discard? Well, first, I would say that the onus is on the person who's giving the impressions or reporting their experience to indicate, if possible, the frequency ranges that they're talking about, rather than just saying upper mid range, lower treble, whatever. But beyond that, the only real way at this point where we can visually communicate some sort of reference point for how headphones sound is by demonstrating the frequency response somehow. But of course, if you just look at one frequency response graph, maybe it was taken on a mini DSP ears rig, and you don't really know where the artifacts are or where the issues are with that rig for certain types of headphones, it might not give you an accurate representation either. So my recommendation would be to first see if you can find somewhere that actually does publish frequency response, ideally one that's using one of the more accurate head and torso simulators like from B&K or from Gras. The second would be, if regardless of where you find this frequency response measurement, make sure that you understand what that measurement means or what the target curve is that's being used. If it is one of the mini DSP ears rigs, make sure that you know which compensation is being used. If you're expecting a base elevation like the Harman target curve has, and the target compensation that somebody's used doesn't include that, and it just looks like it measures flat across the board, well, that's going to sound pretty boring in the bass to you if that's what you were expecting, right? Once you figure that stuff out, you'll have a much better sense of the way that something is going to sound or was likely to sound. And of course, nothing is going to replace just actually listening to it and putting it on your head. So you're going to have to bite the bullet at some point, and you want to just make sure that you're making an informed decision, or the most informed decision that you possibly can. So I hope that this video has given a little bit of insight into why I like to defer to people's experiences and assume that their reports are genuine, rather than just saying, oh, you're wrong about this, or you made a mistake here. Because while that might be possible, maybe somebody just wasn't paying attention to the right thing, it's just as possible for any of these reasons that I've just mentioned that they actually did hear what they did, and then this accounts for why it contradicts with the way that I heard something. Or again, same thing, if you're just reading two reviews that contradict one another, it's very likely that one of these factors was somehow involved in how these experiences were reported. Anyways, that does it for today's video. Thanks for taking the time to watch it, and I'll see you guys in the next one.